biblical moral codes on the rest of a society that is very uninterested in being a life. So that's not free in any sense. The other theme from last night was Project 2025. And you need to understand, and I certainly came to understand this a few months ago. It's really what triggered my alarms and got me involved in creating this Stop Project 2025 task force that was part of this snow. Clear to me as I learned about it that Christian nationalism runs through Project 2025 in a big, big way. In some ways, they're kind of one and the same. So you can slog through the 920-page document and just see in place after place after place so many of the agenda items that you're going to hear about in this town. And so we've kind of figured out that the best way to stop it is to just tell people about it, make sure they understand it. It's the same way with Christian nationalism, right? They're not shy. They're not holding back what they want to do to our government, to our society, to our democracy, to our individual freedoms. They talk about it quite openly, laboratory. Christian nationalism on its face sounds okay, right? It just sounds like Christianity, which, has historically been such a dominant cultural and religious part of our country, and a dire and sinister threat it is to our democracy and our individual rights. And it's a little bit trickier because we have something in this country called Christian privilege, which makes us sort of, by default, very deferential to any comfortable talking about anything that represents itself as Christianity or, for the most part, religion. And so that's part of our challenge as well. And that's why this film is so important, because it not only helps make the case to people like me and many of you who are secularists, it includes some of our best messengers on this subject, which is people of faith, good, forward-thinking people. So it's an important film and an important message. Our challenge, of course, is to take it outside of our little echo chamber here of people who already get it and make sure that people across this country, especially some of the conservative Christian communities in this country that may have fallen for this Christian nationalist narrative, think about it. Because the one thing I have found is that, I work with people of all different backgrounds, all different faith perspectives. I have yet to run into anyone who actually wants to live in a theocracy. So that's what this is all about, reminding people under attack from Christian nationalism, and this film is zeroing in on one of the most important issues of our time. So thank you very much. I hope you enjoy the screening and the conversation to follow, and thanks for being here, and thanks for everything you do. Okay.
Bishop Barber, Jonathan Wilson-Hartgrove, and Ann Nelson. Thank you.
Just election. Hear our cry and turn our hearts to you.
Nobody knows what the hell is going on. There's never been anything like this. We will not.
Faith is primary for me. Faith is the first thing that I build my life around. My reaction to January 6th was my stomach churned. I was nauseous. I wanted to throw up. People had Christian flags. They were praying on bullhorns outside the Capitol while beatings were occurring inside the Capitol. It was a co-opting of my faith that is supposed to be a faith of peace. From a security standpoint, it was also devastating. We spent 20 years preparing for another bad day. building up intel systems.
The United States of America to be reformed, get rid of the communists, the globalists, and the traitors within our government.
The galvanizing force behind the assault on the U.S. Capitol was a political movement known as Christian nationalism. And to seize power and impose their political vision by any means necessary. They knew that the only way to create a theocratic Christian nation was to overthrow our democracy. And that's what they set out to do.
We love you and we thank you. In Christ's holy name we pray.
When government is in the hands of godly men, it is good. But in the hands of all...
Christianizing America.
You have to choose sides, and you have to get in the fight.
I am a Christian nationalist. Give me the flag, and I'll carry it all the way to Calvary.
We're going to have a new country. It's going to be a Christian nation. Fuck democracy. I stand with Jesus Christ.
They are tearing down the wall at the border and building a...
America first. Magnificent.
How precisely is diversity our strength? Do you get along better with your neighbors if you can't understand each other?
At Patriot Church in Knoxville, Tennessee, God always comes first, but country is a close second.
Do you have any soldiers in the house this morning? If you're not a soldier, hang out here. You'll end up a soldier. So I was there in the Capitol incident that happened in D.C. There were some people there that were breaking windows and climbing walls and being destructive. That's not what Christians do. But what I was determined to do is to stand. We have a right in this country to stand at that Capitol and let our voices be heard. And by the way, that's all our president asked us to do, is to let our voices be heard. Founded this country on Christian principles. They work. So let's stick with them. They've been good to us.
The church has relinquished too much authority to government. We should not be taking orders by the government, from the government. The government needs to be looking at the church and saying, how do we do this effectively?
So the big idea of Christian nationalism is that God made America for Christians. And not all Christians, but a particular kind of white Christian with a particular theology and a particular political worldview. And that group is supreme in this nation, and everyone else is subordinate. And they need to be kept subordinate with violence if necessary.
Let me tell you something. You ain't seen an insurrection yet. The church of the living God is an institution that the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. And the Bible says that we'll take it by force. That's what the Bible says.
Christian nationalism is nationalism. Christianity. It's about power and politics. And let's separate it from religiosity. In this country, we have freedom of religion. We're a secular nation that is built by, sustained by, and filled with people who have deep faith in God. But that's not Christian nationalism. There's a fictional work, Margaret Atwood book, called The Handmaid's Tale. It's man saying that this is God's law and administering it for the purposes of achieving absolute political power. And the societies that practice it in whatever form it takes, are the most evil places on earth.
Preaches to religious conservatives in their countries, what they do is signal that there is a so-called correct religion, one that has access to the president and has disproportionate voice in the public square, and then there's everybody else. I mean, that's how Christian nationalism works.
Is an illegal authority.
Our most recent survey data shows that about a third of Americans are either friendly to or true believers of Christian nationalism, that the federal government should advocate for Christian values, that there should be no separation between
as a Christian nation, and our success as a nation depends upon our fidelity to God's word.
And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution. It was in a stinking letter, and it means nothing like what they say it does.
Tyranny. It tyrannized the people. And so they came up with this radical idea that the people themselves should determine how they wanted to worship, rather than have that dictated by the state.
One by one, through new birth. Someone cannot be claimed as a Christian because of citizenship in a state. So if the state or the culture bullies people out of openly expressing their religious views, one to heaven.
Say a word of greeting to the most resilient, the most courageous.
I'm particular about the Jesus thing. They can't have that brown-skinned Palestinian Jew who said, I come to preach good news to the poor, healing to the brokenhearted, recovery of sight to the... He's already told us what he stands for. And that's what economic policies that cater to the wealthy and hurt the poor, then embolden and intensify your agitation and get everybody to the ballot box. We've got to challenge Christian nationalism that tries to teach us that real faith is being against gay people and for tax cuts. And it's always been a part of this American experience. Those who want to take religion and use it to justify all kinds of evils.
Christian nationalism has been an effective political to them as a new threat. At its peak in 1924, the Klan claimed 8 million members. The vast majority were white evangelicals.
The Klan argued that America was what was the true destiny of America. The Klan claimed to have 40,000 ministers. So if you hear these stories from people that you are socialized in the view of evangelicals, there was a lot of talk about Satan, that it is Satan that is driving these enemies. Once you believe that Satan is an actual present daily force, it adds a tremendous intensity to the commitment to loyalty.
For decades and decades, there has been a strain of Christian nationalism in the American popular consciousness, but it seems to reemerge during times of intense cultural and political conflict, especially when those who have traditionally been in power, white, conservative Christian men especially, feel...
Our nation, at 11 o'clock on Sunday morning, is one of the most segregated hours in Christian America. Any church that stands against integration and that has a segregated body is standing against the spirit and the teachings of Jesus Christ.
Good morning. I'm Jerry Falwell, pastor here. Isn't it grand to be a Christian? I said a wonderful looking congregation.
Today, I draw the line in the dust, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation for...
Regulations or laws or tests to deny the right to vote, then they will be struck down. And under this act, If any county does not want federal intervention, it need only open its polling places to all of its people.
Atheist. Now, if that sounds extreme, so be it. But that is the challenge we face because the other side is working. And the question is, are we willing to work too?
You see, government is the flow of power and force. When government is in the hands...
You who are pastors, who have been chosen by God Almighty to lead, we are talking about Christianizing America. We are talking about spreading the gospel in a political context.
He realized that if he could organize an army of angry Christians into a powerful voting bloc, he could completely transform America.
Make no mistake about it. Even if we should prevail beginning.
In 1980, Paul Weyrich went to Jerry Falwell, who was just a fundamentalist preacher, and Pat Robertson, who had a TV show, and said, give us your lists. Give us your names, and we'll make you household words in America. And they created the moral majority. It was a political power block in their party, in the country. And that's what they did.
Moral Majority is not a religious organization. It's a very political organization, and one's membership is based upon citizenship in this country and a commitment to a pro-life, pro-traditional family, pro-moral, and pro-American position.
Moral Majority, a network of 72,000 preachers, combining to form what some call a Christian political machine.
Everything that we do here is aimed at the next world, or it ought not to be done.
The preachers here turn the meetings over to the professionals, men like Paul Weyrich. He spends much of his time urging ministers to get out the vote.
And then, my friends, we will truly see a moral majority in America. May God bless you.
When I was younger, there was an itinerant preacher who came through for revival. It was a Sunday evening camp church meeting. So, you know, with the piano and the singing of the hymns, you know. Think white 1950s, that's really literally what it felt like. We were listening to the Hellfire Brimstone preacher in the aisle and knelt down at the altar, and Terry started to cry. I started to cry. I mean, both of us were just weeping. There was a very real, in a sense, welcoming home, a spiritual welcoming home. I was very, very soon after that. I was only about 14 years old. I wasn't going to be voting anytime soon, but I had to become a Republican in order to be a Christian.
I can't tell people how to vote. I just go around the country saying, vote for the Reagan of your choice.
With Weyrich coaching, their message was direct. Republicans were the party of God, and Democrats were the party of the devil.
I would say that just about every church in America, the evangelical fundamentalist churches.
That's an extraordinary amount of power.
Yes.
I'm sick and tired of hearing about all of the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists and the communists coming out of the closets. It's time for God's people to come out of the closets, out of the churches, and change America. We must do it.
It was in God once, so the GOP became God's own party in the minds of people who only heard that story.
I was asked once what book I would choose if I were shipwrecked on an island and could have only one book for the rest of my life.
Reagan is winning the votes of 26% of the white electorate who are followers of the evangelical preachers. This group is providing Reagan with his clear margin in the election.
Weyrich had succeeded in harnessing the evangelical voting bloc. He had found his army, and it became the Christian nationalist movement.
So help us God, we will make America great again.
president-elect who is committed to help us pass a human life amendment through the Congress. We all agree that life begins at conception, and we're willing to stand up together in the defense of voiceless, defenseless, unborn babies.
One of the most durable myths is that the religious right galvanized as a political movement in direct response to the Roe v. Wade decision of January 22nd, 1973. And it is utterly false. Jerry Falwell, by his own admission, did not preach his first anti-abortion sermon until February of 1978. That's more than 5 years after the Roe v. Wade decision. Religious right responded to a court ruling, but it was not the Roe v. Wade decision. It was a lower court ruling on school desegregation. June 30th, therefore it has no claims on tax-exempt status. It got the attention of people like Jerry Falwell, who had his own segregation academy in Lynchburg, Virginia, and in particular Bob Jones University, which had a long history of racial discrimination. And that provided the catalyst for the religious right. It had nothing to do with abortion. Wyrick's clever move was to recognize that if he really wanted grassroots evangelicals to be part of this movement, he needed an issue other than defense of racial segregation in the late 1970s.
It was the most politically sensitive case before the Supreme Court this term. The ruling has dealt a severe blow to the court.
When the constructors of the religious right came together in 1980, they made their principal battle cry to turn the Supreme Court. Why? Why would they do that? Why would they choose the Supreme Court? Preserve white patriarchy. Then you want a conservative Supreme Court. The masterminds of the religious right did not raise the white supremacy flag. They raised the abortion.
In this historic decision, the Supreme Court has now overturned Roe v. Wade.
This is the moment America and women's rights went back in time.
Extremists on the United States Supreme Court have decided that they can force all of America to bend to their personal religious and moral views.
The White House Rose Garden was co-ops, waiting for President Reagan and Judge Sandra O'Connor to stroll casually into view.
In 1981, President Reagan nominated Sandra Day O'Connor to the Supreme Court, but conservative evangelicals felt betrayed. She was pro-choice.
We are very disappointed at the president that he's apparently going against the 1980 Republican platform.
Right-wing opponents of her nomination were claiming that she's not only pro-abortion, she was also alleged feminist.
The White House people who were sent here, they ran against Washington to get elected, but they have now been co-opted by Washington. I'm not the kind of conservative that says preserve the status quo, because I think the status quo in large measure is awful. Rather, let us change the premises upon which we're operating.
Paul Wyrick realized the Republican Party was not committed to his goal of a theocratic America. In 1981, Wyrick co-founded the Council for National Policy, a secretive network to spearhead the Christian nationalist movement. 40 years later, it has become one of the most influential political organizations in the country.
Paul Wyrick was grand architect of the movement. He talked about the way that but they felt they had the right and the obligation to do that. Now, why did they feel entitled to dominate American society? Why should these people have dominion over the rest of us? A lot of the Council for National Policy's vision was rooted in a form of Calvinism, where the belief was that God favored certain people and that was reflected in their level of prosperity. So if you were a very rich person, that's because God had predestined you for salvation, And on the other hand, if you were a poor black single mother in Milwaukee, that was because God had predestined you to be that, and he did not favor you with the wealth. And what we do.
You said that you don't like to fly commercial because you don't want to get into a tube with a bunch of demons. Do you really believe that human beings are demons?
No, I do not. And don't you ever say I did.
You need to send in $35,000. You need to send in that $100,000 check. If you do not write that P.O. box and you do not, and your dream will die.
So their whole worldview was to increase income disparity as a gesture of God's will. A lot of their writings sound as though they believe they have a direct line to God.
At the core of Weyrach's political ambitions to overturn democracy was Rousas Rushdoony's vision of a theocratic government.
Today, one of the very foundations of Rushdoony's theology, often called Dominionism, is to try to reconstruct the nation along Christian lines, according to the Bible, according to biblical foundations. And democracy, especially liberal democracy, isn't really necessary to that. In matter of fact, liberal democracy is kind of the enemy.
And you think democracy has
the
will of the majority?
If we love these liberals as we must, if we love these people who are, despite the terrible pain that it takes to even say it, helping to murder the unborn as we must, then we want what is right for them. And what is right for their immortal souls is to get them out.
Not ensuring that fair elections happen.
I don't want everybody to vote. Elections are not won by a majority of people. They never have been from the beginning of our country, and they are not now. As a matter of fact, our leverage in the elections, quite candidly,
allows the state legislature to take over local election boards.
You're going to vote for Trump whether you like it or not. You got no choice.
We are seeing rejection rates from anywhere between 25 to 40%.
It is designed. James Crow Esquire. He went to school, got a law degree, and he has come back to try to take out every progressive voice in this nation.
Wide reach to build their grassroots movement. But to truly change the culture, they needed to find a more substantial donor base.
In Oklahoma, where I grew up, we called it the... In the 1980s, when you have the entry of these incredibly wealthy oil barons, putting money into political campaigns and political operations. And so they found that they had natural allies with fundamentalists and evangelical Christians. People work for the oil companies. The oil company people go to the churches. One hand washes the other.
Weyrach struck a deal with oil and gas billionaires. In return for their support, he would make the council a powerful political voice for eliminating their corporate taxes and regulations.
If you look at the roster of the Council for National Policy, you see these names surface again and again from these key states.
The Council for National Policy was founded as a place where major money could be invested toward making their narrative the mainstream interpretation of what it meant to talk about moral issues in public life. And I think that was very much a response to the role of religious leadership in the mid-20th century and in the civil rights movement. The power of a voice like Martin King's demanded a moral majority to answer it. In tobacco country, the Sunday after Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, an incredible amount of money was invested in targeting communities like ours to use our religious identity to make us part of a voting coalition. Goal as a teenager, and it's what got me involved in the kind of formation programs that the religious right had established for people like me. I figured out how to apply as a 16-year-old to be a page in Senator Strom Thurmond's office. People like Strom Thurmond because they were pro-life. What I began to see when I got up close and began to participate in the so-called pro-life politics is that it really didn't have much to do with serving life. Senator Thurmond was the chair of the committee, and so there was a whole lot of talk about how to serve the interests of military contractors. I began to question whether biblical values really mattered very much to these folks. When I came back to North Carolina after that experience in Washington, D.C., I went to a meeting that the governor's office hosted, and there was a motivational speaker. By the time he had finished with this group of, young political hopefuls, he had all of us up on our feet. It was almost a sort of tent meeting revival kind of feel, and I wasn't entirely sure what had happened to me. So I got to know the Reverend William Barber as a 17-year-old kid, and he began to introduce me to the long tradition that he was part of, a tradition of people who took their faith very seriously, but always connected that with work for justice in the world.
I think it's an abdication of my Christian responsibility not to remind politicians that the budgets you pass in these legislatures that hurts poor people and takes health care from sick people, that in fact you are violating fundamental values of the Christian faith, which are love, justice, and mercy.
Christian nationalism is incredibly powerful because of the money that's been invested in it, but I think it's also absolutely essential that people realize it is not the majority position in this country. It's not even the majority position among Christians. I think it's
the first time that we've been attacked on our soil, and by far the worst result. I really believe that the pagans and the abortionists and the feminists and the gays and the lesbians, all of
the religious right wielded significant political power. But American society was no closer to their vision of a Christian nation. No one was more disheartened than the movement's architect.
We are continuing to decline as a nation. Our culture is continuing to decline. What kind of trade policy you have, if in fact the moral fabric of the society has disintegrated.
Weyrich commissioned a manifesto which describes in detail how a Christian elite will take power in America by waging an insurrectionist war.
The manifesto is the purest distillation of Weyrich's inadequate. They weren't guaranteed of winning elections, and in fact, played by the rules, they would lose more and more elections unless they figured out some detours.
The Council for National Policy and the folks who were coordinating their attempts to maintain control decided that they couldn't use the institutions. They needed to delegitimate and destroy them.
What's going on here? They're shredding it. So yes, it's been a declaration of internal warfare.
Because of our covenant with God, we are equipped and delegated by Him to destroy every attempted advance of the enemy. We take back and permanently control positions of influence and leadership in each of the 7 mountains.
One of the most common expressions of dominionism is called 7 mountains dominionism.
Take it from a Levite.
The idea is that you can't take over society unless you take over the 7 crucial pillars. They realized that all of culture was against them. So they said, all right, we don't like Hollywood, we'll invent our own Hollywood. They've done that.
Spirit of God, I have chosen.
Saw it. It was like it was twisting and fighting. Everything that they told us is a lie.
At public universities, many students were liberal. All right, let's direct them towards Bible colleges and create this youth corps that Paul Weyrich asked for in his manifesto.
What we're doing at Turning Point USA, I believe, has the opportunity to soon happen in the halls of Congress.
They claim to have trained some 200,000 candidates and campaign managers through the Leadership Institute.
It will not be enough just to win the next election. We got to win the next generation. And that's what the Leadership Institute is all about.
You go into every sector, and just as Paul Weyrich's manifesto laid out the plan.
It's been a long time coming. But tonight, because of what we did on this day, in this election, at this defining moment, change has come to America.
The 2008 election swept Barack Obama and the Democrats into power and devastated the Republican Party. The council saw the 2010 midterms as an opportunity to...
And no segment of the electorate is more frustrated with the U.S. government and President Barack Obama than the folks driving the Tea Party movement.
The Tea Party movement has a lot to do with Barack Obama's presidency. And the Tea Party was also a reaction to the Bush presidency. What happens in 2008 is we have a mortgage crisis. Tens of millions of Americans lose their jobs, lose their homes. Not a single Wall Street banker goes to jail.
Americans believe that Washington's Tea Party movement is an expression of that sentiment.
What Tea Party voters believe by 2009 is this. Barack Obama set out to change America, and he succeeded. But he didn't do it alone. He did it with the help of a corrupt, feckless, weak Republican establishment who sold out.
The council enlisted Tea Party members to compete against incumbent Republicans, infiltrate the Republican Party.
A lot of the groups that you've supported have essentially provided financial fertilizer for the Tea Party. Would you agree with that?
Yes. If we had to agree with everything a group or a person stood for, we would never do anything.
The Koch brothers put $50 million, $50 million, into a state-of-the-art political data platform called i360. They had considerable success through their operations.
The Republicans will take control of the House of Representatives.
The Tea Party captured political lightning in a bottle and helped elect dozens of new congressmen. They came on a promise to shock Washington into spending less, cutting more.
The council's gambit worked. The success of the Tea Party brought Christian nationalists into the GOP.
So what you have is the Republican Party trundling along in its traditional way, but this parallel structure that's growing up that's going to supersede it. And it gets to the point of power and influence that it can mount a hostile takeover of
party extremism, where the argument is the way to a better society is to deny education, deny health care, deny voting rights, deny women's rights. And then if you want to really have a great society, the extremists are saying give people more guns and give more policy demands a moral response. We decided that if they were going to crucify health care and crucify living wages and crucify voting rights, every crucifixion needs a witness. Every crucifixion needs somebody that's willing to call it what it is.
Somebody asked me the question, when will you stop? Well, that's a question for them. Don't ask us when we'll stop. When will they stop hurting our economics? Because if they stop, we'll stop. But we can't stop as long as people are being hurt.
Before the end of the summer, thousands of people showed up every Monday, and they looked like North Carolina. I mean, they were white. That racism is not just about hatred of black people. It is really fundamental about hatred of democracy. And racism becomes a tool for feeding the corporate greed of a few who want an aristocracy and nothing that looks like a democracy.
Gentlemen, we know how much you love hand-raising questions. Is there anyone on stage who is unwilling tonight to pledge your support to the eventual nominee of the Republican Party and pledge?
I remember hearing from a family member that Donald Trump had met with a group of faith leaders and he had become a Christian. And we needed to view him, even though he has this horrible, morally depraved past, we need to view him as a King Cyrus.
President Trump, he liked Cyrus.
Trump has the Cyrus anointing.
God was raising him up like Cyrus.
The point being that Donald Trump is going to be this pagan king that God is going to use to rebuild the America that is crumbling. I really don't think we can underestimate how powerful that was for a certain segment of the Christian community. You feel like you're participating in, in the prophecies. And
what I'm concerned about is the reputation of evangelical Christianity and the credibility of the Church of Jesus Christ right now. When people who previously told us character matters are now just waving away really serious and shocking character issues as though they're all. It's just leaving a wreckage of cynicism in its wake. In the case of Trump, I was concerned that evangelical Christianity would become synonymous in the minds of people inside the church and outside the church with Trumpism. Many evangelical Christians agreed with me then. It wasn't until after the primaries that they didn't.
The evangelical leadership remained skeptical of Trump. So
please join me in welcoming the presumptive Republican nominee for president, Donald J. Trump.
Reid saw Trump as the perfect vessel to deliver on the council's goals.
Here we are, and here are the goals. We want to uphold the sanctity and dignity of life. As you know, I put a list.
Pledged their network's resources to his campaign if they could influence his judicial and cabinet appointments. Trump agreed.
The Bible means a lot to me, but I don't want to get into specifics.
Even to cite a verse that you like?
No, I don't want to do that. I mean,
Where the Spirit of the Lord, right?
When people question how these fundamentalists with their relationship to the Bible can choose Donald Trump as their candidate, it's not because they identify with him and feel that he's one of them. It's because he can be an instrument.
In these places, so that believers and other viewpoints can go into them and establish credibility also.
I believe without a shadow of a doubt, this is the last election. It's a math problem of demographics Obama and Hillary Clinton want to bring into the country. This is the last election when we even have a chance to vote for somebody who will stand up for godly moral principles.
What white evangelicals lacked in numbers, the council made up for through the vast network of faith leaders and high-tech mega churches which spread their message.
Our mission is to champion the pastors of America for the transformation of America.
Leaders of the movement know that pastors drive votes, and so they draw pastors into networks such as Watchmen on the Wall, which is an initiative of the Family Research Council. It has tens of thousands of affiliated pastors, and they delivered these pastors messaging materials that they can use to turn out their congregations for the hyper-conservative politicians that the movement favors.
Father, we thank you for the grace that you have bestowed upon this nation.
President of the Family Research Council, Tony Perkins, was the president of the Council for National Policy. There is no error between them. And the Family Research Council publishes voter guides. They're called the iVoter Guides. They're allegedly nonpartisan, but you basically have the...
Tuesday, you get the privilege to live out a biblical Christian worldview when you go to the poll.
What this network of organizations has done has, for years, involved data mining.
A series of very deep ties to adjusting something that became known as the Glue Insights micro-targeting platform. That's a platform that accesses and harvests data on all Americans. They've actively harvested using that for micro-targeted Facebook advertising to harvest very vulnerable individuals, and then they had a very high uptake of conversions and radicalizations entering into those large evangelical churches.
Now you think of your average target voter, and you go back a few...
Every one of those households is going to be contacted by this organization 7 to 12 times.
So if you're this person out in Missouri, this is all the information you're getting. Newspapers have been dying off. Local news is disappearing from thousands of counties in the middle of America. And what fills that vacuum? It's Fox and Sinclair, which function and sing in harmony. So you don't have the newspapers. Your broadcasting environment has changed. When you go online, It's not just that you've chosen a silo, you are a target for a multifaceted operation of tremendous sophistication.
Thank you. I've just received a call from Secretary Clinton.
A complete earthquake. This wasn't like any earthquake I've really seen since Ronald Reagan in 1980. It just came out of nowhere.
I'm looking at some numbers here. 81% of evangelicals voted for Donald Trump. You got it dead right.
This is historic. No Republican nominee has ever gotten that level.
Won the election. I believe it was God. God showed up.
With the council calling the shots, the wrecking ball went to work.
Her critics say she wants to privatize the public school system that she once called, quote, a dead end.
Donald Trump is forming his cabinet very much in his own image.
Sworn enemy of the EPA to be the head of, what's the word? The EPA.
Some of these folks' only qualification is that they have attempted to destroy the very agencies that they are now hoping to run.
President Trump revoking the Obama-era law expanding federal protection to streams and waterways across the country.
Behind me, we have evangelical leaders. We're going to be signing a day of prayer.
$5 trillion tax bill.
Trump told friends at his Florida club, you all just got a lot richer.
National Security Advisor Mike Flynn saying the quiet parts out loud.
We have to have one religion, one nation under God, and one religion under God.
As Trump rose, all of these groups, Paul Weyrach's group, people were viewed as fringe players, as extremists. They formed within the party the base of his movement.
The Conservative Action Project is a division of CNP. The president got tired of everybody coming to our meetings, so now we meet at the White House.
We are watching the foundation shift, and we're going back to our founding principles. We poured millions of dollars into judicial nominations and vetting to make sure the president picks the best judges.
I, Brett M. Kavanaugh, do solemnly swear. So help me God.
You are really special people. Much more, sir, than you've promised, and I think that's true. In many respects.
I think most of Americans would be completely oblivious to the designs behind this, that there are intentions to enshrine Christian identity and a certain kind of Christian identity as the law of the land.
Meet Project Blitz, which funnels religious bills to state lawmakers all across the country. The ones that have been passed in 6 states already are the In God We Trust bills, which mandate that slogan go up in public schools.
Senator Marty.
Thank you, Madam President. 79% of Americans believe in some supreme being's beliefs. I don't want government pushing my religious beliefs or anybody else's religious beliefs on others. That's what the core of religious separation of church and state is about. It was probably a Thursday when we were voting on that resolution. It didn't take long to figure out what happened. It was on Fox and Friends that morning. Those of us must hate God, and therefore we were trying to block even this innocent little harmless thing.
Why?
And wipe it out of government.
When we stripped God out of the schools, we replaced it with something else, like ideological indoctrination, and we're seeing the fruits of that right now.
Christianity is in the crosshair today. There is a concerted effort in this country by the secularists to ignore our history.
It is horrific. And yes, we know other faith groups are also being persecuted, but Christians have a giant X on their back.
The notions that evangelicals or the religious right is aggrieved in this country is, on the face of it, I think is preposterous. I think a case can be made that these people, in fact, are the remainder of society.
They're actually demanding a license to discriminate against those of whom they disapprove, and they're asking for an ability to override the law when it conflicts with their religious beliefs. For some Americans, that's a cause for alarm, and for others, it's the answer to their prayers.
With the same divine rights given us by our Creator in heaven, and that which God has given us, we will allow no one ever to take away, ever.
Christian nationalism really did create Donald Trump, to the extent that without that kind, felt like they had been wronged the last 8 years under Obama.
No, he's not an example of Christian virtue. No, there's not much about his life that you could compare to the life of Jesus. But neither has this movement ever been about shaping people in the way of Jesus. This movement has been, you need to have the biggest, baddest gun possible. And in the White House, you also want the biggest, baddest gun possible. And Donald Trump is that gun.
Joe Biden's following the radical left agenda. Take away your gun.
Nationalism represents a tremendous threat to democracy. It's one thing if you feel like, hey, my political position is correct, it is justified, it is backed up by research, but it is another thing when you feel like we are on the side of God and you are on the side of Satan. It's demonic, it is evil in a cosmic sense. If you bring the ultimate, if you bring the sacred into this argument, then you can justify just about anything in the service of defeating this evil power that is out to get your people, that is out to destroy your country, that God has a special relationship with.
I don't care what you think about fraudulent Sleepy Joe. He's a sex-trafficking, demon-possessed mongrel. He's of the left. God, he's...
American life, we have a church growth movement, but for angry people. A sense of theatrical anger feels to some people like depth of conviction, when, of course, it's theater. But that can build a crowd.
They're trying to shut down our voice. Like Paul Revere said, the British are coming. The British are coming. Well, the leftists are coming. In fact, they're already here. So we aren't afraid. We aren't fearful. But I'm telling you, the Bible's about to get really real.
When Biden says something about unifying the nation, people like me are convinced that we cannot unify with that, because good cannot unify with evil. And so I don't see a way of coming together in this issue at all. This is more of, we have to take a stand against this, and we have to defeat it. It has to be defeated.
Most of the Bible was written under persecution. Whether you like it or not, we're going into the soldier realm, where onward Christian soldiers as a hymn becomes real. That's right. There is an intensity right now, and yes, I am very concerned that this is going to end up in a civil war. I think it's very important that every American home that can own as many weapons as possible. I think peaceful people that are well armed keeps a peaceful nation.
This is breaking news.
Around 2:30 this afternoon at a Tops supermarket, at least 10 people have been killed.
In a 180-page document posted online, the suspected shooter often referring to black people as replacers, a reference to the Great Replacement conspiracy theory.
Jews will not replace us!
I think the danger of white Christian nationalist rhetoric to Muslims, to Jews, to Hindus, to atheists, I mean, that's obvious, right? Not only are we subordinate, in many cases, we're the enemy. We are the reason that they need to rise, because not only do we need to be subordinate, we need to be defeated and vanquished.
Ms. Newman, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Raskin. Whether it's an attack on a school, a nightclub, a synagogue, a mosque, a church, it really needs to stop.
In 2017, when I joined government as the Deputy Chief of Staff to John Kelly, I didn't notice any focus on domestic terrorism. The counterterrorism community was still very focused on ISIS. And then Charlottesville happened.
When you say the alt-right, what about the alt-left that came charging at the, as you say, the alt-right? You had a group on one side that was bad, and you had a group on the other side that was also very violent.
Because of the way that the president reacted, domestic terrorism became another one of those no-go hot topics that if you raised at all to the president, he immediately became defensive. The Secretary of Homeland Security multiple times asked for the White House to include domestic terrorism in the counterterrorism strategy that the administration eventually released, and we were rebuffed. So by the time we have Christchurch and then sadly another attack in Poway, California, And that all leads us up to El Paso at the Walmart, and they're using language straight out of the president's campaigns. He has the opportunity to set the record straight. He doesn't do that.
Thank you to the Council for National Policy. Together we're committed to keeping America safe, strong, prosperous, and free.
The Council's gamble had paid off. Christian nationalists were firmly embedded at the highest levels of government. The Supreme Court had an absolute majority of justices, poised to overturn landmark civil and women's rights decisions. Paul Weyrach's vision of a Christian nation was becoming a reality.
The president is extremely well positioned for re-election. So we got to get past this coronavirus speed bump. It's unlikely that we're going to have a recession. If we don't and we do our job, historically, he should be re-elected.
Trump appeals to the authoritarian impulses of his supporters. They're often referring to him as a king, a biblical king, an imperfect leader through whom God chose to enact his will. Now, here's the thing about kings. They don't have to respect the rules. They are the law unto themselves. And that underscores the fact that this is an anti-democratic movement that doesn't believe in representative democracy.
CNN projects Joseph R. Biden Jr. is elected the 46th president of the United States, winning the White House and denying President Trump a second term.
If you count the legal votes, I easily win. If you count the illegal votes, they can try to steal the election from us. If you count the votes that came in late, we're looking at them very strongly, but a lot of votes came in late.
Well, there we go. The president's comprehensively demolishing the American democratic process. It was almost as if he was describing a Zimbabwean election or something going on in Belarus.
The council went into full combat mode to support the big lie, and the entire Christian nationalist movement quickly fell in line.
This is a spiritual battle we are in. This is good versus evil, and we have to do everything we can to win.
We're actually standing in the middle of Jericho because we have penetrated the walls of Jericho, right? There is evil and there's corruption, and us inside of this barricade, we're going to knock those walls down, okay?
Michael Flynn was part of the Council for National Policy. On December 18th, he shows up in a meeting at the White House where there is a discussion of the imposition of martial law as a possible way of addressing the electoral crisis.
I mean, these people out there talking about martial law, it's like it's something that we've never done. Martial law has been instituted 64 times, Greg.
Martial law was about hoping that the January 6th event would create a state of what you could call controlled chaos. And there's a level of chaos that will require us to hold the election again.
I think that this is the biggest steal that we've ever seen. Donald Trump's a fighter, and we're here in Washington to back him up, bringing thousands and thousands and thousands of people this Saturday for our march.
All of a sudden, you see various components of the Council for National Policy coming in to participate. You've got Ali Alexander, who registers Stop the Steal. Charlie Kirk states that he's sending buses to the protests on January 6th. Ginny Thomas, the wife of Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas. Once you started to have this convergence between CNP organizations, QAnon, and the fundamentalist sectors, you had something that escaped control of the leadership, but it also escaped visibility.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are not just up against politicians, and we are not just in a culture war. We are in a kingdom war. This is the kingdom of darkness versus the kingdom of light. Do you feel that?
We will not let them silence your voices. We're not going to let it happen. Not going to let it happen.
Of the kingdom of Jesus Christ is an illegal authority.
We start hunting them down one by one.
What is right for their immortal souls is to get them out of public policy in this country.
It's possible to draw a line from the January 6th Capitol riot back to that manifesto and to plot just how a culture was built in which mainstream Christians could feel completely legitimate, indeed could feel righteous, participating in an act of trying to overthrow their government. They would rather tear it down, they would rather burn it down than going along with it. And in that way, I think it's very much a holy war. People who understood themselves to be in the army of God were waging a war to try to reclaim the United States for God.
All individuals must leave U.S. campus grounds or be subject to arrest.
Many Americans are reeling tonight, saying they can't believe this is their country.
Legislators did go back to work tonight to try to finish what they started, to officially make Joe Biden president.
What does it say to the nearly half the country that believes this election was rigged if we vote not even to consider the claims?
The assault on democracy continued inside the chambers of Congress. Senate and House Republicans rejected the slate of electors, though no proof of electoral fraud was ever presented.
What always happens when you look at autocratic movements is one guy is not enough to give it lift. Is there a charismatic leader with the capacity to build a cult of personality? 100%. Donald Trump did that. But that's not enough for an autocratic movement. You need to have a propaganda arm, and they have theirs. But that's not enough. You need to have the cynicism of the elites, the most highly educated people in the country. Harvard University's Ted Cruz, Stanford University's Josh Hawley, who look at all of this and say, I can ride that tiger. I can manipulate these rubes who actually like this guy to my own advantage. Because at the core of an autocratic movement is no morality. In fact, it's immorality or amorality, because it's about power. And in the pursuit of that power, history teaches us terrible, terrible things happen.
Tonight, as the nationwide firestorm continues, following Friday's Supreme Court decision that overturned Roe v. Wade.
Clarence Thomas suggested the court could re-examine decisions on contraception and same-sex marriage.
This is another major ruling from the court's emboldened conservative majority, resetting that delicate balance between church and state.
With just 22 days until Election Day, democracy is very much on the ballot.
The Trump Show's second act that will test his grip on the Republican Party today.
You can call us extremists, you can call us domestic terrorists. You know who else was called a lot of names? Jesus.
There's a movement in this country that is demonic. It is the transgender movement.
We're taking over school boards. We're taking over the Republican Party. We're taking over all the elections. Suck on this.
The vast majority of Republicans have embraced the big lie. They have kowtowed to whatever Trump wants because Trump has a loyal base of support.
The biggest thing coming out of January 6th is that people are emboldened to take matters into their own hands.
We need to have a white uprising. I don't believe in democracy. I don't support women's rights. We need to take control of the government and force the people to believe what we believe, and you are going to become a Christian.
Most Americans, no matter how they vote, really care about the same things. We need to be the party of nationalism, and I'm a Christian and I say it proudly. We should be Christian nationalists.
Forward together! Not one step back! Forward together! Not one step back!
This is a moral, constitutional moment. We say it clear today. If you allow the infrastructure of this democracy to be fractured and torn asunder, this nation will pay a deep price.
My mom taught me at a very young age that Christianity and faith was about doing what we can to be of service to others. I want every child to feel seen, heard, and supported, not marginalized and targeted because they are not straight, white, and Christian. And I know that hate will only win if people like me stand by and let it happen.
They said no one cared about democracy, that the only thing voters care about is the economy. They were all wrong.
Right-wing justices overturned Roe v. Wade and fueled one of the biggest backlashes in American politics.
This would have been a red wave election if not for millions and millions of young millennials and Gen Zers.
What I think these midterms have shown us is that at least in part, there has been a nationwide rebuke to Trump-backed extremism around the country.
I believe we're in the moment right now that's primed for a movement that leads us into a resurrection of America. And I believe if we do it right with love and justice, many of the people who have put on Christian nationalism will take it off, will get born again, will see the gospel in its truth. And that's what gives me hope even in America. I'm not an optimist. No. I'm full of Christian hope, which looks at the despair and at the destruction and at the denials and at the deceptions and say they are real, but they don't have to have the last say.
Now, one of the reporters that interviewed me the other day said, well, you know, you people think that everything is black and white. Everything can be reduced to simplicity. And I accept that charge. Amen. Ultimately, everything can be reduced to right and wrong. Everything.
As a preacher, I'm always making the connection between the ancient story of God's people and the world that we live in. And one of the most basic connections is that the worst evils never present themselves as evil. The worst evils always present themselves as the good.
Christian nationalism is on the rise and people are thirsty for it. We are the Christian Taliban.
34% of Americans think violence to achieve your political aim could be justified in certain circumstances. Folks, that's the definition of terrorism.
In a country where 40 to 50% of people don't vote, you don't need a majority to win elections. All you need is a disproportionately organized and very, very committed minority of the population.
We must be prepared to do battle in every arena, in the media, in the courtroom, at the ballot box, and in the streets. We want total war.
My attitude has always been that democracy is more fragile than we think, and it has to be actively defended. Paul Weyrich understood this very well. He said straight out that he wants to blow it up.
So regardless of what happens to Donald Trump, it's the machinery of the Council for National Policy that has the staying power. And it's that machinery that presents the lasting threat to our democracy.
This moment requires an ability to orient to reality. And reality is the Republican Party is more extreme, more dangerous, and more committed to the autocratic project of gaining power right now than it was on January 6th of 2021. And this has to be confronted, and there is no issue that supersedes it.
Every generation has had its challenge and has had to face, and we just have ours now. We're from California to the Carolinas, from Massachusetts to Mississippi, from Alaska to Arkansas, and we ain't going nowhere.
And then we should have some for the... Thank you for coming, and I want to thank Bishop Barber and Nelson and Jonathan Wilson Hargrove for coming so that they can answer some questions.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming.
Welcome to the YouTube audience. I think we're live streaming, so, right? Live streaming, is that right? Welcome to all the folk out in YouTube land as well.
You've got an echo, I think. Who would like to ask a question? Yeah.
Can we get you on the microphone just so everybody can hear?
Yeah, is there another mic we can use? That's it? Okay.
Right after Trump won, there was a blossoming of indivisible groups, and at one point they actually outnumbered the Tea Party groups. What do you see out there that would give us the same kind of hope for grassroots efforts? Or do you see things going through more established political parties like the Democratic Party?
One of the things you saw in the film, the closing scene there, is from the Poor People's Campaign, and we happen to have one of its co-chairs, so maybe we could talk about that.
Yeah, I think that... Let me ask you a question this way, kind of being a historian and a theologian, okay? We have to, a little bit, while we focus on Trump, as you heard the people say Trump didn't create this, is that this is not some anomaly, okay? And then we look through history at what has defeated it before. This is as old as slave master religion. And it's always connected to money. Like slave master religion was connected to the cotton industry. Most wealthiest people were in the South. And they had to fund a religion that would justify their slavery, right? And they came up with what I call 5 principles of justification. bad biology, that skin color determines brain size, sick sociology, that people can be together, but somebody has to be high and somebody low, evil economics, the ends justifies the means, political pathology, any discussion that's going to change the reality of slavery gets pushed off the table. But the last one that we often don't talk enough about is heretical ontology. And they funded that. They made sure it was in the pulpit. That's why you can go in the stacks of the libraries at Yale and Harvard, the theological libraries there, and find all of these books that justified slavery way back, right? And were highly funded. Harvard's Law School was funded by the Caribbean slave trade and so forth. Then you get, during Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the New Deal, a religious movement funded by Sun Oil, the National Chamber of Commerce, whatnot, that basically says, look, the New Deal is irreligious, it's sinful. And they bought pulpits all over the country. And then you come up to the moral majority. The point I want to make first is that this is not new. So what has had to happen always has had to be a movement of faith, right, in public policy. The thing that you must do the most to undermine Christian nationalism is you cannot undermine Christian nationalism arguing about it as a and hear me when I say I'm not putting anybody down, but you can't merely laugh at it and you can't merely dismiss religion. You know, just that actually fuels them, right? You have to have what I call, it has to be exegeted as heretical. And you need, one of the great things about Steve's piece is he brought evangelicals into this conversation to say that is not evangelicalism. Not only is it not Christian, it's not evangelicalism. And you have to have Christians that don't frame themselves as left or moderate. We just want to talk about Christianity. And the greatest weakness of some of the critics is the lack of Jesus. The folk that want to criticize this stuff, they don't want to talk about Jesus. And the greatest weakness of Christian nationalism is the lack of Jesus. You notice in that film, not one time did they say Jesus thinks like this. Not one time. They would call it religious. They might say God, but they never had one scripture to justify that Jesus believes this. And so their weakness is the very thing they call themselves. To say you're a Christian something means you have to be following Christ, which means if you want to challenge it, you have to have a movement that challenges it from the standpoint that this is not Christ, because this is what Christ said about the poor, about the least of these, about immigrants, about women, about those kinds of things. You can't dismiss. And then lastly, I think that when you look at the end of that film, and you saw in Texas, in Austin, Texas, we did a 3-day march into Austin. 10,000 people showed up. In Texas, of every race, creed, color, preachers, Episcopals, UCCs, Christians, Catholics, Muslims, Jews, and all walked 3 days in so-called deep red country. And Steve, what amazed me doing that walk was how many people were blowing their horns in support. How many people were saying, because we were talking about true evangelicalism starts with how you talk about the poor. If evangelicalism is anything that's called evangelicalism or Christian nationalism, if it's Christian and it does not start with how we address the issue of the poor and the least of it, that right there proves it's heresy. It's not Christian. So we need a massive movement. That's what you saw. I think the juxtaposition of the Christian nationalism to a massive grassroots poor and low-wage workers campaign with poor people, religious leaders, and activists is the antidote, if you will, to this sickness that is not a new sickness. What we're seeing now is, it's kind of like when you have an infection and it affects your hand, but then you go septic. And when it goes septic, everything starts functioning right. Your brain doesn't function right, your eyes, all of it. But it's curable, right? But the antidote is not going to come now I'll say this and shut up, 2 seconds. What, because I know everybody's enthusiastic, but what has scared me at this convention is that I was hoping that each night in the main section where you have the Oprahs and where you have the big names, at least 10 minutes would be given to poor and low-wage people of every race, creed, and color to speak to the nation, put a face on this. And they would acknowledge, some of them, their faith, and they would say, the reason I'm with this campaign, because the first thing she did was mention poverty, child poverty. The second thing is living wage. The second thing I was hoping, and some of us asked for it, is that there would be in prime time a 10-minute section with clergy from different faiths, right? Not making the mistake of making the Democratic Party the party of God, but instead clergy on that stage talking about how standing up for children, standing against poverty, wanting living wage for people, fighting for health care, are the kinds of things that the God of the Bible, the Jesus of the cross, wants us to do if we're going to be a moral society. I'm still praying that happens tonight. I'm still praying that happens tonight because what you saw at the other convention is they put those things up front. I'm a little long, but that's my,
yeah, I just would like to add that, yes, certainly it's really important for the things that Reverend Barber is talking about to take place. And I've been traveling the country with the film, with the opportunity to speak with a lot of people. To your question, one thing that these organizations depicted in the film have done very skillfully is to have big donors networked with media systems like Salem Media and others, with 501c3s that are actually their surrogates who do canvassing in parallel to Republican canvassing. So in my book, I describe the Claire McCaskill campaign, where the Republicans and the Democrats did their canvassing, but then the Susan B. Anthony list, which is part of this, the National Rifle Association also did their canvassing probably on a more intensive basis. So you've got this network of C3s, C4s, and super PACs, which work in coordination with the donors and the media. And that kind of coordination is powerful. I see glimmerings of it coming, you know, some strategy taking shape on the Democratic side. And I think that it will be important for groups like Indivisible, Red, Wine, and Blue, and other groups to have a kind of coalition sensibility, have greater inroads with donors, and also copy something else from their playbook, which is their understanding of the swing states and the actual electoral map, rather than making people feel good in New York and Los Angeles.
I think what you're saying about a big coalition is good. And the other thing I would add, and this is why I really believe in what Bishop Barber was articulating in terms of a poor people's campaign that has a moral basis, there has to be a constructive vision, right?
That's right.
It's not enough to just say we're against Christian nationalism.
That's right.
Because the people who've been caught up into it don't think about it as Christian nationalism. They think about it as the only way to understand Christianity. That's what that's what was presented to me as a young person. So to be able to see another way to be Christian, to be Jewish, to be Muslim, or to be a secular person in public, but that has a moral center to it, that's critically important, and that has to have a sort of a organizational home. So some way to offer a broad coalition of people, that vision, I think, is critical.
Steve, I see his hand. I want to come back to your question after a couple of more, but one thing I do want to say, in the Bible, just so you'll know, Pharaoh always had his false prophets. I want you to say this is not new. There's always been this tug, right? And the only thing I'm arguing for real heavily is this is the work of the faith community and impacted people specifically, because the Pew Foundation did a study a few years ago, and I always like to ask the question, what did we do to allow this to happen? Not just blaming other folk for it happening. And they studied 50,000 sermons in Christian pulpit, 50,000. And they looked at the bookends of Jesus' ministry, which was preach good news to the poor, caring for the least of these as a political, social, theological challenge to society. Those themes didn't register in what's being preached in the American pulpit. Not talking about among so-called Christian nationalism. I'm saying they couldn't find anywhere where the issue of the poor and poverty and the least of these was preached more than 1% of the sermons in a year, even though it's the main subject of the scriptures and the main subject of Jesus. So when you walk away from what you claim you believe, you leave a vacuum for something like this, funded heavily, because they ain't playing, right, Ann? They are not playing. They can easily feel that void. And so I'm arguing for folk like myself, clergy and congregation. We have to, along with the least of these, the left out, the remnants, this is a battle that we must take on. And I'll talk a little bit about structure before we end. Yeah. The guy back in the back had his hand up first. Yes, with the blue shirt on.
Hi there. Yeah. Thank you. I'll try to keep it short. So thank you for this documentary. It really opened my eyes to a lot of things. I want to throw out a question, and you tell me if this is bothering you a little bit too, or if it's a non-issue. I've been watching the convention all week, and I've been very inspired and amazed at the production values. It's a very polished presentation. One thing that's bothered me just a little bit is that, and y'all can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't remember any speakers going up there and just mentioning in passing how their faith has inspired them to enter public service and is a motivating factor. That's bothering me a little bit, but I acknowledge it could be a non-issue, and I'd love to get your take on that.
Well, my take is that I think it's problematic, and I think that, and not just my faith, I pray, but how religious values, which are in the Constitution, they're in the Declaration of Independence. You know, if we're swearing to, if we say we put our hand on that Bible, we swear to uphold the Constitution, which says establishing justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and ensuring domestic tranquility and equal protection under the law. All of those things are not just things in a constitution, but we believe they are rights, they're inalienable rights, that we believe in the divine. Then we shouldn't throw it like in anybody's face, you have to believe like me, but we have to have a space where it's okay. The problem is, again, is that too often what happens in the public space is we talk about religion from the personal side, you know, like praying and whatnot, and not from the policy side. When I was asked to speak in 2016, I've never told this public, so I'm going to tell it today, a little bit. I'm going to tell you all of it. First of all, normally what we do with ministers at the convention is we ask them to pray. Think about it. You've never had a convention where you asked a minister to talk about economic policy and faith. Which I think,
and the prayer, by the way, is what happens after they cut away the commentary at the end of the night.
That's right. It happens after, or it happens before they turn to the 9 o'clock. And then faith, even among Democrats, if you say we're going to have a faith call, normally that means a black call, like black religious leaders, which I was so glad the other night to see evangelicals. We don't talk about faith call being like the broad spectrum of faith in this country. And too often, I think we should be talking about ending child poverty as a moral issue, not as a Democrat or Republican issue. Living wages as a deeply moral issue, and we should talk about
all of the pieces of it, and we should be talking to the people. When Ann mentions swing vote, here's the struggle. The swing states in this country are really the swing states. 40% of the voters in the so-called swing state are poor and low wage. You see, poor and low wage. The Democratic Party has in its platform a goal to end poverty. The challenge is to get somebody to say that from the main stage. For some reason, they're scared of it. But if they framed it as a moral issue, if they framed it as something that came first out of the mouth of the prophets and out of the mouth of God, not out of the mouth of a politician, it gives a different way. These folk are hijacking the faith. And so, yes, I do have somewhat of a struggle with not just mentioning how it informs you, but we should be talking about how faith and moral values are influencing the policy positions we're taking. And please don't say, when you say morality, well, it's the good thing to do, but it's not necessarily the most practical thing. A moral position to end child poverty is an economic theory that this country wants to embrace, because we actually spend more money allowing 51% of our children to be poor and low wealth than we would spend if we actually address the issue.
Yeah, one response to the story you watched in this film, of, in particular, this religious nationalist movement that emerged since the late 1970s, one response to that was, if those people are going to be so overt about being religious in public, we're going to shy away from religion, right? And I think that's kind of what you're reflecting and what you say you've seen. So we have very much argued that we need good public theology to respond to very bad public theology, and that's why Bishop Barber established a Center for Public Theology at Yale Divinity School. I just wanted to mention that if you're in a context, in a religious community where, having resources to help people think about this, because there have been so few, we just published an online course for this fall. It's on our website at the Center for Public Theology. It's free, and you can do 12 hours of content on this with some of the best thinkers about it in the country, which I think is the kind of work we want to be doing in faith communities that haven't really been resourced about how do you talk about this.
This film is also being used in churches all over the country to sponsor a conversation. I just came from churches in Fort Worth and Omaha, and the conversations are really great. It gives them a basis to reconsider what's going on with these politics, but also their own faith.
Thank you. I think you said earlier that there needs to be the people who oppose Christian nationalism need to have kind of a positive message, and my question kind of gets at that. I guess I'm just wondering what specific policy issues, pretty specific. I mean, I understand ending poverty in general is a huge one, but and one thing I'm the chair of the House Elections Committee in the Minnesota House of Representatives, and they talked about all the voter suppression laws that have passed in other states. I guess I'm curious, so we passed things to counter that, like automatic voter registration, pre-registration of 16 and 17-year-olds, restored the vote to people who put prison behind them, passed a Minnesota Voting Rights Act. So very concrete things. I guess I'm curious about what sorts of policies you'd advocate for, particularly in states where there is an opportunity for democratic control. Since we're at the DNC here, one thing to end poverty we did was pass free school lunches.
No. Well, can I answer?
Sure.
Because I want, and hear me, we're gonna have a conversation. We're not, but just listen kind of the way, and I'm not knocking it. When in the room say, well, yeah, ending poverty, I get that. No, it's bigger than that. See, we're talking about is. And it's not even where you just have democratic control, because our movement, we go to East Kentucky, we go to the Deep South in Mississippi, because we're running a moral campaign, because we believe that the notions of left versus right and Democrat versus Republican is too puny. As a preacher and a person who's a Christian, I'm informed by the scripture that the stones that the builders rejected and the remnant in every dispensation of history, become the salvation of nations if they don't listen to the poor and the least of these. So here's what we're talking about. We're talking about, in America right now, we have a reality where there are 140 million poor, low-wage people, 140 million. That's 43% of all the adults and 51% of all the children. We're talking about a reality where 800 people are dying a day from poverty and low wages. When we got to 500 people dying a day from COVID, we call it an epidemic. We're talking about 295,000 people dying a year from poverty, poverty being the fourth leading cause of death. We're talking about abolishable, unnecessary poverty. We're talking about 55 million people who get up every morning and work and make less than a living wage. We're talking about there's not a county in this country where you can work a minimum wage job of $7.25 and afford a basic two-bedroom apartment, and that we've not raised the minimum wage since 2009, which means that's been, we're talking about 87 million people who are uninsured or underinsured. We're talking about 350,000 people that died during COVID for the lack of insurance, not COVID. COVID didn't kill them. Access killed them. We're talking about whether the poorest county in West Virginia or the poorest county in Mississippi that's black, the poorest county in West Virginia is predominantly white. Both counties, the people there died 3 to 5 times more than wealthier communities. So when we look at it at that level, it's not just a issue. It is the moral issue of our moment, because we're talking about 60% of black folk, which is 27 million people, but 66 million white people. So the first thing is we're not even talking about poverty, right? We're not even talking about it in terms of color. Actually, there are 40 million more poor and low-wealth white people than there are black folk in terms of numbers. So here's what we're arguing, is that we've got what we call a third Reconstruction agenda. I'd like to ask you to go to the poorpeoplescampaign.org, and I think this is why Steve put us in the movie. In that agenda, it has 21 action steps where we, with the best scholars and all, say that if we have the resolve to do this as a nation, we can end these realities. We raise the question it's not whether we're great again or whether we're great now, but what's the responsibility of greatness? So, for instance, first thing we have to do is declare that we are not going to accept 800 people a day dying from poverty and low wages when 7 people died from vaping and it became a presidential level issue, right? So we talk about living wages, we talk about the strong social safety nets, we talk about fully funding public education, we talk about a woman's right to choose, we talk about full voting rights, expanded voting rights, because now 50 million Americans, not black folk, 50 million Americans are impacted by voter suppression. It's not a black issue merely, it's an American issue. So what we've done is produced a 17-point agenda, right? And we're saying to people, look at these candidates rooted in this agenda that number one, it's not even radical, it's just right. And it needs to be implemented at the federal level because we can't wait state by state by state. Technically, what this nation is saying to us, and I'll stop here, it took us 400 years to get the $7.25 minimum wage. 400 years. So we're going to have to wait till another one to get 400 years to get to 15. The March on Washington in 1963 wanted a $2 minimum wage. They wanted to raise the minimum wage to 75 cents, by 75 cents, index it with inflation, which would have made it about $17 an hour today. So when you really dig down in what we mean by saying challenging and ending poverty, it's the issue. Because this crowd, they got 5 issues, basically. Anti-gay, anti-women's right to choose, anti-voting rights, pro-gun, pro-corporation and tax cuts for the corp, and pro-Republican, their brand. That's their basic agenda that they are arguing is a God agenda. While we got all this suffering going on. And lastly, I would want us to hear this. COVID did not produce the numbers I just shared with you all. Those were the numbers going into COVID that both parties have, to some degree, not fully dealt with. And COVID exposed those numbers. And the death of all of that gives us a moment now, because even in Mississippi, 60% of Republicans now want health care because of what they experienced during COVID. So we got to have a deeper conversation about what we mean and then the policy that goes along with that. Jonathan, do you want to talk about the policy?
Well, let's get somebody else's question in. That's a lot of policy.
Hi, I'm a friend of Ann's, and I'm the leader of a couple of different grassroots movements. And my question is, I watched the movie, and it is disturbing. It's almost hard to watch it again. It's sort of like what everybody felt last night when we had to watch January 6th again. So if you want grassroots to get involved and lead a lot of these, try and, protest this and make people see the other side and everything we've all learned from reading a lot of your books and going to lectures on this topic. I'm just curious, have audiences who are inclined to be very receptive to this found it disturbing to watch, and whether that's had an impact on your ability to get us to be your activists in this movement? Because once we win, God willing, on November 5th, and we can turn our energies towards this issue, which I take very seriously, and there's a component of it that's Christian Zionism that, as a Jew, I take extremely seriously. But this was a little hard to watch, so I'm just curious your reactions to that.
Yeah.
Well, I've spoken now probably maybe 20 screenings in all. I don't know. And I will say that there is a common reaction. First of all, if people watch it by themselves late at night, they can't sleep. So I don't recommend that. I think it's good when they gather together and the lights go on and people have this kind of stunned look on their face. It's like, oh. And then the reason that we have a group of speakers is that the first question is, what can I do? And it's incredibly important to have an answer for that. Because when you say to people, look around you, you're here, you're all here, you cared enough to come. Nobody can do everything, but everyone can do something. Figure out what you can do. You can help get out the vote. You can support your local newspaper. You can talk to your family members, your children, your grandchildren, and convince them that voting is essential. Everybody can do something. And I find that people get excited. And I will admit that they are more excited now than they were 2 months ago. And I expect that the kind of energy that is being generated by you all here in Chicago is going to travel on. But the important thing is that a lot of people previously tended to be passive, take democracy for granted, I'll wait it out, let somebody else do it. And the message is, nobody can sit this one out, right? Everybody has to be strategic and informed and active.
Can I just push back a little on that answer? Which is just, that all I get. I'm talking about Christian nationalism, fighting that, not the vote, not getting at the vote.
So let me address it real quickly. The first thing I do after watching this film with a group is lead a song.
That's right.
And I'm not a great singer, but I learned to be a song leader in a church full of black folks who survived slavery. They knew exactly what Christian nationalism was.
That's right.
And they sang in the face of it, right? So I think we got to root ourselves in traditions that know how to push back against this stuff. And we got to draw on that spirit and that energy to do exactly what you're doing, to do something. You got to do something, but you really need to know that there are traditions that prepared people to face this stuff and to do it, to stand up straight and do it with some hope.
Yeah.
And with some joy.
Yeah. Poor and low-wage people face DOTS, daily ongoing traumatic syndrome. They don't face post-traumatic stress. It's daily ongoing. And part of our history is, you know, we keep coming up, and the Koch brothers did a thing in the 70s where they said, we're no longer going to seek after Messiah candidates. They said, we'll let Democrats seek for Messiah candidates. We're going to focus on policy, and we're going to create the kind of organization and structure around that can push anybody we want. I mean, I'm actually bothered by some people. I told them last night, I'm bothered by some people that said, you're excited now. Because politics is supposed to be about policy, regardless of who the personality is. I mean, if on the one hand you want to argue they got a cult over there, a personality cult, well, you can't then engage in the same kind of just, you excited now? If over here, even before now, you were committed to fighting child poverty and fighting for living wages, and you should be excited about that, regardless of the personality that's pushing it, because it's about the transformation. And one of the things about those Christian nationalism, they know exactly what they're doing policy-wise. It doesn't matter who the personality is. It could be Trump or whoever, right? They know exactly what they're trying to do. They know exactly why. If you understand 2036, you'll understand 2025. Because 2025 is about 2036. That's when the nation is 33, 30.
Just real quickly, that's why they don't care if he denies 2025.
Right.
Because they're going to do it anyway.
They're going to do it anyway.
Without him.
So quickly, I want to, here's a tradition. It's in Amos. Y'all probably heard Dr. King when he said, let justice roll down like water, righteousness like a mighty stream. Part of the problem I have with the way we even remember King is the first 17 minutes of that speech was dark. Because he told us, you don't get, see, hope is not optimism. You don't get to hope being happy. You got to hew out of the mountain of despair a stone of hope, which means you got to look right at the despair. And so in Amos it says, hate evil, love good, maintain justice in the courts, perhaps God will have mercy. And then it says, I'm waiting for there to be wailing in the streets. Consistent, continuous. Now, I come out of the Moral Monday movement where you don't have one protest. You do it for 3 or 4 years. You keep going. You keep building. And so Frederick Douglass, another tradition, when he faced a moment like this, Frederick said, he did a speech. It was an hour and a half long, Steve. The first hour was how bad it was. He called it monstrous. After he described that, he then put a but in there. He said, but it doesn't have the last word. And then he said, perhaps what we are seeing is a necessary link into the downfall of the entire system. Therefore, we must intensify and embolden our agitation. It was the clear articulation of how bad it was, looking at it in all of its ugliness, that proved to Frederick, number one, we must be mighty powerful if they're fighting that hard against us. And number two, our responsibility in this moment is not to back up, but to take these tears and intensify our agitation. So joy, even when we talk about joy, you got to be a joyous warrior. But joy is another term. It's not happiness. Joy is not happiness. There are traditions that teach you can be crying and full of joy. Because happiness is about what happens. It's about the circumstances. Joy is something deeper. Joy is when you get up in the morning and everybody's telling a lie and you can still believe the truth. That's when you have joy. Joy is when everybody is okay with the poor dying 800 people a day, but you wake up every morning and you're not. That's joy. Because that joy is what keeps you standing, keeps you fighting. And then lastly, to fight policy is to fight Christian nationalism. Everything that they're doing, you heard they want to take over the ministry. You remember Paul Ryrick in the movie, he was clear. This is a methodology to take over and reshape the government, really at the end of the day, in the ideology of the greedy. And Dr. King said in '65, the greatest fear of the greedy oligarchy in this country is for the masses of Negroes and the masses of poor white people to come together and form a voting bloc that could fundamentally shift the economic architecture of the nation. And he said every time that possibility happens, then racism and segregation and racist ideology come to the top. Because what the greedy oligarchy is afraid of it. And so that is why one of the things we're saying is in this moment, we're not trying to get people just to vote for this moment. We want them to vote for this moment, but we're doing a love analysis. For instance, what if you knew that the reason we got Trump, this is why I like reading Ann's stuff, because he got so much data and I can use. What if you knew that the only reason Trump got in office was because of 83 to 85,000 votes in 3 states where 4 million people didn't vote that were poor and low wage? See, we got to come at it that way. We've actually made Trump too big because we've not done the analysis. He's not running a popular campaign. He's running an electoral college. But what if you knew that in every battleground state, we claim battleground, I think there are more, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, North Carolina, let's take those 3, Florida. If you add up the number of eligible poor and low-wage voters, who, by the way, 2 things you should know. Number 1, don't vote against their own interests in the majority of the time. That's a lie that we've been told. And number 2, the number 1 reason they don't vote is nobody talks to them. Nobody does a political ad, nobody does a radio ad, nobody includes them in the conventions, blah, 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 blah. But what if you knew that, say, Wisconsin 1.2, Pennsylvania 1.3, well, that's 2.6, North Carolina 1.1, that there are 7 million votes in those states alone that are infrequent, poor and low-wage voters. Most of them already registered. But not one of those states was the margin of victory more than 100,000 votes. 20,000 in Wisconsin, 10,000 in Michigan, 40,000 in Pennsylvania, 74,000 in North Carolina, 11,000 in Georgia, and about 100,000 in Florida. What if you knew that? Would that bring hope? Because now the situation has changed, because that's power that's sitting right there. And Celinda Lake, what's her name? Celinda Lake helped me so much one day. She slapped me in the face with her words, which was good. Every now and then you need a slap. Because then I was like, I had bought into this whining, and Celinda said, listen, let me tell you something. Go look at these numbers. She said, here's the problem. And she said it for even Democrats. She said, if they don't get over this, the greatest swing vote in this country right now, the greatest potential for expanding the vote is poor and low-wage folk that tend to vote progressive, but nobody talks to them. So we did a study, you can read it, called Waking the Sleeping Giant. And in all these states, there's not a state that I just named, if you organize 5% of poor and low-wage voters that didn't vote to vote around a progressive agenda, that it wouldn't change the outcome. Now that means you can fight from an offensive position rather than a defensive position. So what we're doing is we're reaching out starting next week to 15 million poor and low-wage voters. We shut up and we went and got them. We're not doing it for Democrats. We're not doing it for Republicans. We're calling people to do it for themselves. You want to join? We got a number you can join. You can sit right home and reach them. 15 million of the 30 million poor and low-wage infrequent voters. Poor and low-wage voters, last time 57 million voted, 30 million didn't. It's 87 million total. And there's not a state that I named where the margin, 10% of those persons in those states mobilized would not fundamentally change both the federal and state outcome. We have to hew out of this mountain of despair a stone of hope. And I want people to see, when I do these films and people see it, the folk that I'm doing with it, and I'm not talking about black audiences, I'm talking about black, white, or wherever they are, most of the time, folk ready to fight. They're ready to do something. See that this. In fact, in one place they said, "Thank God for this movie being done to tell in picture what we already knew." It's like this is a confirmation. We knew this stuff was going on. When Ann wrote her book, and I read 2 pages, I cussed. I was so happy. I said, "Damn! I knew this. I knew this was some money, but I've been thinking this, you know." And I'm saying, well, you know, that's why we want you see, every movement has to have movement academics. You got to get some folk that realize what you know. Like, it's like, I knew this was true, I just didn't have a footnote. But now that I have a footnote, I can be loud and right. See, I don't like to be loud and wrong, I can be loud and right. Thank you, Ann, because she actually is giving us, her and Steve have caused us to say, we ain't crazy. You know, I thought I was crazy, Steve. I thought, you know, people look, I said, you know, these folk can't be building these big churches. The people don't have enough money. How are they on TV all the time? I know the TV costs this much. I'm just wondering, like, well, why in the hell? And then I read this book, and then he did this movie. I thought he was a little nutty when I first met him. I didn't know who he was. And I said, wow, we got a book, we got a movie, we got people, we got data. Now we go to work.
And that's why I gave you 1,000 footnotes.
That's right, 1,000 footnotes. That's right. Excuse my 2 curse words. Hope they didn't offend nobody. They are biblically approved, though.
Well, I just want to first thank all of you for being here. As an openly non-religious delegate, this is especially scary to me, you know, the threat of Christian nationalism and this continual anti-secular movement that I feel just won't die down unless we fight back against it. So thank you all. Stephen, I wanted to see if I could sort of direct this question to you. Is there anything in the course of making this film that particularly surprised you along the way? That as you did, I mean, even more than one thing, but just like you went into it and you were like, wow.
Yeah, well, a good question. Yes, there was. First of all, I started this thing in 2018, and my goal was to, when I discovered Christian nationalism, the goal of the film was to show that it had the potential for political violence. After January 6th, I didn't have to prove that anymore. The next question was, okay, what do they want, and how do they want? And one of the key points, and really the smoking gun for me, was seeing in Ann's book, Weyrach's Manifesto, because they wrote it all down. They wrote it all out, just as they've done now with Project 2025. They can't help themselves. They're so full of themselves. They're so convinced that they're in their bubble that everybody, as soon as people see this, they're going to fall in love with it too. But for me, when I saw that they realized they would never be a majority. They were against democracy. Also, Rushdoony, the complete nut who was their kind of guru, who said that God was against democracy, but knowing that they decided to actually destroy democracy because they would never win otherwise. There's no way they were going to win through democracy. Okay, so the next thing was realizing that the divisiveness and the distrust of institutions that we have now in America, that exist now, it's not happenstance. This was the success of their plan. We're living now the success of their plan. Their plan has succeeded in totally dividing this country, because when you've got distrust of elections, you have a void. Into that void steps the need for a strong man. This is the classic playbook. So we're living all that now. So that's, to me, when I saw that in the film, when I saw that we put that in the film, then I realized that people still weren't quite, even when they'd watched the film, they didn't quite believe, is this true? Do these people really are against democracy? Yes, they are. Americans can be very naive, in terms of the country's never been invaded. There's a sense, there's the exceptionalism, which is another myth. Things that have happened elsewhere in the world can and will happen here, and bad things too, if we don't do something about it. So, to me, finding out that there is a significant minority of Americans who want to destroy democracy, put an authoritarian leader in place who they think is going to do well for them, which is insanity, thinking that they should give up their freedom and give it to somebody else who's going to then give it to them somehow. So I would say the challenge, and the reason most people who see the film are think, boy, this is connecting the dots. But the next point is making sure, I guess I don't know how you do this other than gradually understanding. And I think as the country's become more radical in the last year or two, people will look around and see that it's happening now. So it's not so much like this what might happen. It is happening. The Supreme Court, the corruption of the judicial system, the voter suppression, putting in election deniers in important positions at state and local levels for elections, recipe for disaster. The last thing I'm going to say is that it's very clear that Trump and MAGA don't believe in democracy. They don't believe in elections. This election is performative for them. He's going to claim that he won. He's going to say that it was fraud. And there's going to be violence. And that's why it's important for as many people as possible to understand what is going on so that we are prepared to deal with it. Because we are the majority, but we have to be an active majority. So what the film taught me and what the research taught me, and thanks to Ann and thanks to Bishop Barber and Jonathan and the other participants in the film, this is deadly serious.
That's right. That's right. That's right.
Yeah.
And see that he's going to do it, he's going to sue, but if we also just understand it's not just it's Trump, he's the point at this point. But what Ann's piece does and what we've tried to write, even in this book we just recently did, Jonathan, on white poverty, is understanding the roots of it, the depth of it. It is as American as apple pie, this effort. It's kind of like, and this is an ugly word, but in the Bible it says, the dog returns to his vomit. Paul said that about people who are always mean. He says dogs return to their vomit. This is a regurgitation with money and more resources than ever before. They've practiced this many times, but they just didn't have the kind of resources, media, technological. That's what Ann had, the money. But the other side of that is those resources are available to us. The technology, different, and if it was built, it can be undone. I mean, if it was created, it can be overcome, but it's not going to be overcome with just a political vote. We actually have to need a movement vote in this country. We don't need. There's a line in. How many of y'all are movie buffs? Any movie buffs in here? There's a line that y'all look. If you get a chance to look at it tonight, I think Jonathan looks at it too, in the movie called The Titans. Now, remember that movie, The Titans? And it was about when Virginia had shut down all the schools over racism. Y'all remember that? Remember The Titans? Okay. And then these two coaches, and the black coach ends up being the head coach, but he keeps on the white coach. And so there's this scene where the referees are cheating. You remember that scene? They're cheating. And they're cheating to try to get the black coach out. But the white coach has decided that if he allows that, it's going to hurt him, his daughter, at a deep level. It's serious. This is real. It's not just about football. It's about who he will be in history. He pulls his team to the side and he says these words, "Leave no doubt." He said, go back on that field. Don't just win this game, but leave no doubt. So in this moment, even if the President Biden was still on the ticket, whoever's on the ticket, that's not what the issue is in this moment. The issue in this moment is not just saving democracy, because you can save a democracy that still elects a dictator like Putin or a false democracy. It is what kind of democracy do we want, and leaving no doubt that whatever that is and whatever Christian nationalism is supporting, we're not with that. We don't need just, we barely squeaked through. We don't need 60% of Americans voting. We need 80%, need 75%. We don't need to leave any constituency out. We don't need to say we can do this just with the middle class. No, we need poor, low-wage folk. We need everybody. We need leave no doubt. I believe that's the only thing that will stand against, because as Steve just said, that like a prophet, everything they're saying they're going to do, he will try to do it.
Yeah, I just add real quickly that for me, one of the reasons that it's so important to talk about white poverty in relationship to this is I come from a community where this movement came in and used our faith to get people into political power who made us worse off. This movement hollowed out my home community and so many rural communities across this country, and have told people after hollowing these places out that they need to blame the immigrants. They need to blame somebody else, right? When it's the corporations that have benefited from this. So I think a movement that wants to save democracy in the face of this has to have enough compassion to say, those communities matter, the pain of those communities matter, we're going to go there with a better message. And, as Reverend Barber is explaining, there is a real political advantage to that, because the people in those communities have largely decided that politics ain't going to help them, right? They've been so betrayed that there is a huge potential vote in those places. But I would say to the Democratic Party that it's a real mistake to not invest in those communities. To not, I mean, you can put up field offices wherever you want to. You ought to put some with the intent of reaching those communities, and not just for one election, because again, when they've been hollowed out politically in a lot of ways too. There's just not organization in a lot of these places.
Hi. I work with a lot of individuals that are in the Gen Z range, many of them very well educated. And a lot of them, until the recent change in the nominee here, were not planning to vote. They were very discouraged. There are over 40 million Gen Zers. I think, I was just looking the stats up, I think it's about 27% view themselves as Republicans. There are more of them that are independents, and they are concerned about all of the things in the platform for the Democrats, but they don't trust that things will change. So I wonder how this message can be sent along to them, and for them to believe what you're talking about in terms of taking care of the poor, taking care of the people that have not been taken care of to this point.
One thing that I found in speaking to Gen Z is just talking to them about the sheer extremism of Project 2025 and how closely tied it is to the Republican ticket. And yes, we can talk about the poor. Many of the student groups I talk to are not particularly poor, but I talk to them about experiences that people in this room may remember. I say, do you know what the term shotgun wedding? And they shake their head and say, no, what's that? And then you explain it to them about, you thought about medical school, you thought about law school, sorry. Did you know that it says that someone can be fired from their job only for being gay? No, they can't imagine that. Well, we lived it. We lived it, and it's not pretty. So you look at Project 2025, it removes everything from climate policy and environmental regulations, and as we all know, the poor communities in our country suffer the worst degradation of pollution and environmental illnesses, right? They say they care about the environment. Do they care enough to go vote for a party that purports, that promises to defend environment and pursue climate policy? So I think that there are things that they care about. I think with every group, it's a question of not only talking about what is right and moral and productive for society, right? I mean, Increasing minimum wage is good for the economy, as it happens too, right? It lifts all boats. But also looking at the people you're talking to and figuring out what affects their personal life day to day and include that.
And it's really important to recognize with Gen Z, when we're talking about poverty, we're talking about the reality that they face.
That's right.
Right? I mean, poverty has been misrepresented
right.
as this kind of small group of people that, you know, have you might see them out, you know, sitting on the street corner begging or something. No. There are, like what Barbara was saying, there are 140 million people in this country who are within a $500 emergency of literally not being able to make it.
Right.
And a lot of those people are young people. So you don't talk about just income, but you talk about wealth. Young people who come with, you know, education debt into jobs that don't give them that much money and then have to figure out how to pay rent in our cities right now. I mean, these are people who are like, if you talk to them about the realities of poverty,
right.
they know what it means to not be able to afford health care, to not be able to, you know, pay their rent. These are real things.
And I think we have to own that. I don't trust. So when I walk in the room, I talk to young people all the time, mixed groups of young people. And one of the interesting things is I was with a group recently of young college students. And I said, what are your issues for this election? Because people had been saying they didn't want to vote and they weren't going to vote. And I found out from a lot of them, no, that's not what we're saying, Reverend Barber. What we're saying is we don't want to take our vote for granted, and we're going to vote. But right now, like everybody else, we're going to demand what we want. And I said, well, that makes sense. And we're not going to go away after the election. So I said, well, what do you want? And they did name, for instance, the ceasefire, which, well, okay, the vice president said on the steps of the Edmund Pettus Bridge that she was for a ceasefire too. So great. But my point is they weren't naming things that others haven't joined in. We've been there. But then, you know what their second issue was? A living wage. And to drill down on that, they said, Reverend Bob, there's two ways we look at this. First of all, when we talk about poverty and low wage, we're talking about somebody, a family of four that make $50,000 or less. Now, when I just said that number, think about how that changes your old image of what you take. It's not about like helping somebody with some food. We're talking about people who make $50,000 or less in a family of four are considered poor and low wage in this society. They said, we come from that, but then others have said, we want to be, What you say? Okay, we want to be a part of changing that reality. And what gets young people more than anything, they say to me, is in their idealism, believing that they're in a moment that they actually can change something. You know, this year, and I wish it would have been mentioned at the convention, is the 60th anniversary of Freedom Summer. When young people who couldn't even vote, if they wanted to vote, fought to win it. In other words, they didn't get to vote until the 70s, right? 18-year-old. But they were out there, Swanner, Cheney, and Goodman. They died, you know, Jewish, white, black, because they saw the possibility of doing something that would have historic change. And I think that's part of what we have. We have a lot of young folk in the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for a moral revival. A lot of folk that we work with repairers, a large number of this peer-to-peer group of 2,000 or 3,000 folk that we're going to be reaching, these 15 million, are young people. But their distrust, let's just be honest, is real. And what I mean by that is, we sit here right now, and some days I get very bothered. I have to hold it back in a certain way. We should right now be a nation where the minimum wage is $15 indexed with inflation. We had the vote, and it passed the House, and it got to the Senate, and 8 so-called moderate Democrats and all the Republicans united to vote against 55 million people. I understand young people's distrust. Those 8 people went against their own party platform. That's what they're talking about. We had a vote on the John Lewis voting bill. We did. We passed it. It got passed in the House. Got to the Senate, all Republicans and 2 Democrats, Manchin and Sinema, said no. So think about where we would be right now in this convention. If we could actually have been at this convention, I say we as a nation, not as a Democrat, I'm an independent actually, with the person running for the presidency able to stand up and say, over the last 4 years, not only have we done this in infrastructure, not only this, but we have lifted 55 million people out of low-wage jobs. And that's 43% of all African Americans. And we have restored and expanded voting rights. We can't say that because of 8 Democrats on one vote and 2 on another. That only gives more openings for this stuff. And it creates the kind of, so what my message to young folk is, then you need to vote so again, it leaves no doubt and people won't dare vote against you because they know that you are the swing vote and that there may come a time for the purpose of teaching folk a lesson that your vote doesn't swing. And this is the last election that you're going that you say with your vote. Now, my vote is a demand. I'm telling you right now, this year, I'm voting, and it's a demand. And if in the first 50 days of the new administration, if you win, and these things don't happen, if I give you the Congress, I give you the Senate, the House, and I'm going to push for it, I'm going to nonviolently push for it, but I'm telling you, you're not going to get me back the next time with, come on, you got to vote. If it requires us to do something different for a lesson's sake, because we can't be played with anymore, because not only is your votes that block policies that help poor and low-wage folk a bad policy, it is a death producer. That's, I think, how serious these matters are.
Okay. We're going to do one more question because we're this gentleman in front, and then we have some food and drink. So one last question here.
I'm just thinking about 2 things I picked up. One thing in the film, you were talking about where these people went to school, the educational backgrounds, in terms of so-called being leaders of our society. And then when you were talking about morality. And I wanted to also say that, to me, there's another component which connects with the education, which is not only morality, but intelligence. You see, that just because, of course, one has education doesn't mean that they're acting intelligently. And then also, when you're talking about morality, it's the lack of morality is also the lack of intelligence, because intelligence, to me, goes along with morality. And then I connected that with what you were saying earlier about slavery. We had this was the same model. There were people who were educated. There were people who were acting, in their opinion on the behalf of morality, who thought they were intelligent. So I'm just seeing those commonalities once again, just constantly recycling,
One of the things you see in the film is the focus of the so-called Dominionist movement on these sort of 7 areas, one of which is education, and it kind of lays out how, there has been an intentional effort to fund and recruit people for, education that forms them in this distorted vision. Another piece of that is a real attack on public education and on higher education that has also been part of the media arm and the communications of this whole movement. So, there is a contest over what education is and what it should form people to be that's at the heart of this. And I think that's an important way of saying something that's central to the film, which is that this political movement that has used religion recognizes that, religion touches on everything. Religion, from the Latin root, religio, is the same root as like the ligaments in your body. It's like what ties a society together. And so I think what they're touching on is the power of people's religious vision and values to influence the way they see all of life. I think that's a very human thing, and that any effort to push back against this has to recognize that it has to be multifaceted. Yes,
right.
It's about what people do at church. It's also about what people do in education. It's about how people live in their homes. It's about popular culture. It's about all this stuff, because again, it's a mistake to think that the way to respond to this is to just sort of try to stay away from religion. Well, no, religion is a varied thing in human society and the world, but it's been a pretty universal. And I think we have to take seriously the way that it, and many different kinds of religious faith, bind people together.
I'll just say that I've traveled to every state in the country except Alaska and Hawaii. I'll get there. And all over the world. And what I observe is that people's fundamental values are not limited by their religion or lack of it or ethnicity. I find incredibly decent, humane people in every religion and no religion, every race. I also find some pretty frightening people who have corrupt values, who embrace every religion. You know, there are Buddhists who are massacring people in Myanmar, right? So I just have learned never to judge people by that. And I take that with me in speaking to everybody that sees this film. And part of what I want to say is, don't let them own the word Christian, right? They don't own it. They've claimed it, but they don't own it. And God forbid anybody should judge all Christians by what they support and maintain, because it's just factually inaccurate. And as the good Reverend Barber points out, I have a very academic approach to things, and this is certainly a falsehood.
Well, you make a mistake if you think that these folk are not very well trained. They are. I remember when the insurrection happened, and two mistakes the media made. We'd never seen anything like this before. I said, do you all remember this same place was burned down and civil? I mean, we make these statements that don't fit history. And also, they say these are just people that don't have jobs. No, most of those folk that are out there were upper middle class, high class folk, very educated. These people are not folk without education, right? They feel like somebody's going to take them. We're not the majority of poor folk. Poor folk were working somewhere, trying to make it, and low-wage folk. I do think, real quickly, that the only way you can make somebody not challenge them claiming the word Christian is you have to go to the founder and the book of the founder, or the story of the founder. That's the one thing we have. We have a founder who is very clear about his political stances. You don't have to guess. He's very clear. He said, the first sermon he ever preached, he said, if you follow me and you follow my spirit, you will care about the patokos, the poor. It's a Greek word which means those who have been made poor by economic systems. You'll care about the least of these, the left out, the sick, the immigrant, the women, the disregarded. I mean, it's right there. It's the bookends of ministry. So you have to know that in order to challenge them on being Christian. You have to say, well, you say you're a Christian now, well, let's deal with that first part. Tell me what you mean by, what are Christian values? And if they run to say, well, being against gay folk, you say, well, now where's that in the red letters? Where's that where Jesus spoke? You won't find it. That's why they never bring it up. Their problem is their Jesus problem. You heard me say it. The Jesus is their problem. They're trying to claim to be an allegiance with somebody who they do not talk like or sound like. And we can't back up from pointing that out. The last thing is, I don't consider myself, I was on Bill Maher, and Bill Maher said, I'm an atheist. And I said, me too. And he said, what? And I said, yeah. I said, if you try to teach me that the God is a God of hate and meanness and destruction of the least of these, and I'm an atheist to that too. I don't believe that either. And he kind of laughed about it. I said, the fact of the matter is, as a person who reads the scripture, The one thing I know about the prophets and about Jesus is their faith was determined by how you knew who they were by who they aligned themselves with in society, who they cared about. One of the greatest texts in the Hebrew Bible is, "Woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children pray," P-R-E-Y. Isaiah 10, you know. Isaiah 58, which is used in doing was it Yom Kippur? No, the time of repentance. Religion that I want. Not that you fast and turn over your plate and look sad, but this is what I want. Loose the bands of wickedness. The translation of that in Hebrew is pay people what they deserve, because when you don't, you put them in chains. And it says, and when you loose the bands of wickedness, when you bring the poor into your families, then when you treat people right in the workplace, this is actually scripture, then you become a repairer of the breach. So we have to have people of faith and clergy and others challenging this reality. It has to be challenged. And we have to challenge it historically and theologically. I'm not trying to make anybody a Christian when I challenge this, but I'm also not going to allow them to go around and claim that I don't have to defend God. I have to stand with the Christ of Scripture. And to stand with the Christ of Scripture is to stand with the poor, stand with the least of these, stand with the broken, stand with the rejected, stand with the lepers. Who are the lepers of our society? Any group in this society that people are told to stay away from. Gay, trans, these are the modern day lepers. Where did Jesus stand with? He stood with those folks. Y'all see what I'm saying? And so I close with that to say we have to do serious intellectual work. You know, we got to have a moral agenda. We got to have a moral articulation. We have to have agitation in the street, legislation in the court. We have to have historical reflection in our books. We have to have theological exegesis. We have to have political participation. It's not one secret bullet. You know, it's all of it combined. All of it. And if we do that, every time these things have had their moments in history, they've been undone by movements, moral movements that challenge them. But the great warning of Steve and Ann here is this. Never before in history have they had so much resource and the depth that they have now at the very central places of government. And that's scary. That's the place that makes us need to get up every morning and say that in America we do need a moral revival. We do need a revolution of values, as Jonathan wrote, because this thing is literally a cancer on the soul of the country, and we can't play with it. And that's why there's a little tear in my eyes. I came here Thursday hoping that with Steve's film and some other things, there would be a couple of tweaks in the normal way we did presentations from the main stage. I really did. And I got a little tear. Doesn't mean we're going to quit. Doesn't mean we're not going to fight and do what we got to do. But there's a little tear right here that we didn't at least have a coalition of clergy to go up and frame what freedom means from a faith moral position. That we didn't at least have 20 speakers, maybe 3 on each day, who were poor and low wage, who took the stage and declared why they were supporting the agenda based on how it would impact their lives. It's right there. Doesn't mean we're going to quit, but it means we still got work to do, even among ourselves. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. That's a really good note to end on. Thank you very much, Mr. Barber and Nelson, Jonathan. Now there's food and drink. Thank you all for coming.
And Stephen, thank you for making this film.
Thank you. Yeah, it was a pleasure because I got to meet these great people.